Excited today to talk about some very important things that affect our industry, and in particular, what's at stake for healthcare marketers in the 2024 election. In terms of learning objectives, it's 6 weeks, until the elections, and our expert panel today will explore the potential impact on healthcare marketing, specifically diving into AI, advertising tax, and data privacy policies. So we hope you enjoy today's presentations. I have some starting notes before I turn it over to our wonderful speakers. First, I just wanted to say also thank you to Havas for hosting us today at their offices and for their longtime support of the CHC, as a member company. And thanks you to our Executive Director, Jim Potter, for bringing us together and bringing the wonderful esteemed expert speakers today to look at these topics that greatly impact our work. Okay. Before I turn it over to Jim, we've got just a quick introduction to our speakers today, which I'll go through now so that we can move smoothly through the afternoon. And I'd like to introduce Ashley Kassovan. Ashley is the Managing Director of the International Association of Privacy Professionals and AI Governance Center, and serves as the primary thought leader and public voice of the IAPP on AI governance. And through roles in the public sector and municipal and federal levels, she's developed expertise in responsible AI, standards, policy, open government, and data governance. Thank you for joining us. We also have speaking today is Allison Pepper, Executive Vice President on Government Relations and Sustainability at the 4As. And in this role, she works with regulators, legislators, cross-industry stakeholders on issues of importance to the advertising community. We thank you for joining us as well. And we also have Amanda Anderson, Vice President, Government Relations from the 4As. And Amanda's expertise represents members before Congress, administration, state legislators, and state regulatory agencies to protect the advertising industry's ability to do business on issues including data privacy, labor, employment, advertising taxes. And her experience includes 10 years in consulting, public affairs, and Peloton technology. So thank you for being with us today. With that, enjoy the sessions. We will have a Q&A at the end, but if you do have some burning questions in between, we can pause at the end of each section and do that. So without further ado, thank you for taking it away, Jim.
Thank you very much, Violet. Again, my name is Jim Potter. I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition for Healthcare Communication. My job is the easy part. I get to talk about what's going to happen here in the elections. So we're 5 weeks out. And one of the big things is you kind of have to frame this like, what is happening? How is the electorate responding? What's going on in Congress? And bottom line, the answer is not much, only the bare essentials. As you can kind of see in the 108th Congress of things that got done, it's a fractional of any other Congresses. And this has been kind of a downward trend, but this sets all new records. So it means that we have essentially a non-functioning Congress, and we'll talk about why. First, the second reason for non-functioning is really the narrowing of majorities. So getting consensus on any one issue is really difficult. And then even within each party, there's factions. So you've heard about the Tea Party faction, and you've heard about others, and they invariably, the Democrats too, have 3 or 4 main factions, and they invariably will break apart. And so reaching across to the aisle, that's been another litmus test, is no, on certain issues, we're not going to allow you, Mr. Speaker, or Speaker, to do that. In fact, it cost the former Speaker his job because they thought he reached over one too many times, in essence. So as you can see, this is a real market trend that's kind of happened. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's not much fun to work in Washington because when you don't have any consensus, trying to get anything done, pass any bill, becomes virtually impossible. Even because of that, what happens is the committee processes start to break down. And so they don't function well. They don't function on time. The power of chairmen within their own caucuses doesn't necessarily translate to getting work done. It's often controlled, or has been in the last few Congresses, from the top. I wanted to also kind of talk about, where folks are placing their trust or not trust. And I thought this was illustrative. Of course, we see in the US government here, Democrats in blue and Republicans in red. That's something you would expect, 58 to 36. In Congress in general, that's the lowest pretty much related that we've got going on here. And that's, again, kind of a cyclical kind of phenomenon. Here's the interesting thing here. Now, the Supreme Court. I think this is the first time I've ever seen Republicans saying they liked the Supreme Court, but clearly it shifted in power. And power means something. Before, it did have, various times where it would sway one way or the other. During FDR, it was pretty chronic, and he didn't much like it. So he proposed changing the court system. So here we have another process. The other thing is electoral process. Again, kind of a market change of who trusts the electoral process. And I think this is messaging that kind of comes down from the top of the party and translates. But overall, still, those are pretty low numbers. Here's another change to police. Actually, Republicans like police and Democrats don't. That may be because of some of the racial problems that I've been having in cities that probably plays into that demographic. Here's a big one, particularly to healthcare marketers, that I think we really worry about. It's the scientific community. Who trusts the scientific community in media? And clearly, Democrats at 81%. But again, Republicans barely breaking 50%. And that's got to be very, very concerning. So the level of, okay, we don't trust science anymore, is something that's no longer just identified with some outliers, but now is more identified with a particular party when you have those kind of numbers. And then, of course, then this is something we expect news media. Where right now, unless it's Fox, essentially Republicans don't like any news media much at all. And that's the lowest number of this particular chart. It also mirrors kind of the widening gap here that we see in the population. And as you can see from the 80s, even with the turbulent times under the Nixon administration and the loss of faith there, we're seeing a really plunge in trust of not only your own party, but you really dislike the opposing party to an extreme. And you can see their own party, it kind of maintains a certain amount of function. And that is actually, if you kind of look at that, that's who's in power, who's in not power, if you kind of look at that trend line. Again, here's another real change I think we've seen in culture, is the Republicans or the GOP's view of Democrats as one, describing them as the enemy rather than, the opposite political party or the loyal opposition. And almost in turn, we have the same thing with Democrats. And so you see that polarization that's happening out in the community. So that impacts how we talk about elections. Here's another telling detail of essentially how does one trust the other party's president? And you can see even from the Clinton administration, and there were a lot of folks who weren't big fans of the Clintons, but you can see how it's decreased almost to nothing now. So that gives you a sense of kind of where we are with kind of the general political environment and the distrust that is seen. So what's happened because of that? Well, policies have actually been changed more at the state level, and that's where we've shifted our focus. So things we'll talk about today on the privacy front, on AI, even on some of the tax issues, we're seeing a movement more to get things done. And this has to do with, depending upon the issue, more of the alignment. So probably what you'll see here are really clear distinctions. Okay, there's a lot of states that are either red or they're blue, basically a trifecta. All right, they control all three forms, both the legislature and the governor's office, all three powers. And then we have a few states essentially in the middle that are split between that. Now, the reality is in many states, it mirrors what's happening in Washington. Some of these margins are tiny, which means you don't get much done. Anything that you can get done, you have to be able to reach across the aisle. And that's not always too successful. So many of the same things that you're seeing on the federal level are transcending here on the state level. I would have expected to see a lot more purple here in divided government, but what you're seeing is essentially control politically, and then, how that moves. And you're seeing that follow too on a policy front. So we see that, on reproductive issues in particular. That will be one of the key battleground issues that probably frames up these elections. So I wanted to get into some of the races and kind of give you perspective of what's going to, and I'm relying on the Cook Political Report. I've been following these folks since I was a wee little guy, and I used to watch Charlie Cook get up and do this stuff. And so they've gotten very, very sophisticated on how they track and how they go. So I look at them as being probably the most credible source. Any media, as you've seen, sways. And any media story that you say, you can clearly kind of identify where it's coming. And sometimes media just wants to sensationalize an issue. So how they report the news on elections is all over the map. In fact, you'll hear a number of even polls come out. How it's reported on those polls varies greatly, and how that's interpreted in the media. So that's why I'm using Cook. Now, Cook basically says, okay, we've got likely Democrats and likely Republicans and leans in most elections that are decided on the presidential front within a couple points. And you have to remember, in presidential terms, a landslide is like 53%. That's a landslide election. That means you're really turning things. I did a model as a graduate student on coattails, and I'll describe it a little bit more. I'm sorry I didn't pull that out and really kind of try to wrap that into this presentation. But I actually looked at, and there's a regression model that I developed that's pretty good at predicting coattails based on the percentage that candidate gets in a particular election. So when we come here, in this particular election, you see you have essentially you're evenly split on the toss-up races, and there's a bunch of them. So it's going to depend on coattails. Now, I plugged in, I have this model, and I plugged in some general numbers, and I'm going to do it from a Harris perspective. I just plugged her numbers in. So according to my model, that's been about 97% accurate in presidential elections. It's really kind of phenomenal. That if Harris gets 49%, Trump wins, then we have what will change essentially the Democrats in the House will have about a 2 to 3 person margin. And that's typically what happens, the party out of power changing. There's a weight to that. If 50% goes to Harris, and which we think is going to be a very, very close election, then that jumps up between 7 and 8 seats. If it goes to 51%, it'd be remarkable, but it means that most of these races in the toss-ups and probably some of the lean Republicans would go Democrat. And the model predicted somewhere between 14 and 15 seats shifting to the Democratic Party. So what this tells me overall in the coattails and the closeness of these elections, that more likely not, unless something miraculous happens and there's a big, big Trump victory, it's very likely that the House will shift back to the Democrats being in charge. probably by a slim margin if we look at kind of electoral vote totals. That's what we kind of know thus far.
A question related to that. If I
Yeah, go ahead. Question.
It seems like this year, these congressional races that would not have been paid attention. Oh, you want me to do this? Okay. Thank you. So it seems like this year, some of the congressional races that would have not been paid attention to by some of the super PACs are being paid attention to. And for that reason, I'm wondering if the coattail effect will operate to the degree that it has in the past.
That's a great issue. And there is a marginalizing effect that has happened since the advent of super PACs in the 90s. And so it's I would say, yes, there is some impact, but it's not as great as I anticipated. It's a fractional amount. So, but what that can do is if you pump, say, if I go back, if I pump a lot into this capture race and I've got a site time, then I pump millions of dollars, flood the airways. I have a better chance than not than changing that particular seat over. However, what we have in our country, and you'll see it later, is we have people that have already made up their minds, that have already dug in. So getting them to kind of change or to make a markable change, you're looking at a fraction of the population of those who we'd call persuadable or want. So a lot of the percentages, and you won't see this show up on polls as much, a lot of people are locked in. If they don't know, they don't like either party. And so you get to that persuadable. And as many of those folks don't vote because they go, I don't want to vote for either party. So it's a great point, but it is really from my modeling that I did, it's a fractional kind of input. It can have a big impact where you have no money. So I would say right now, where you're seeing that is actually the presidential elections. Well, you see the Harris campaign is flooding social media with all kinds of advertising, nothing coming from Trump. And so that campaign is a little bit in disorganization. And a little bit, I think the candidate is a little bit of a control freak on how that information goes out, and he believes it all should come from him. So those two factors. Now that will be very interesting in the post-analysis, whether that kind of infusion of cash actually was able to change persuadables. Clearly what it's done in the interim, since she's a nominee till now, it's bumped her up. So her approvability, her likability has gotten much greater for a candidate who basically just came into the race a couple months ago. That's probably the most remarkable thing, but great question. Okay, so New York, I just wanted to give you, this happens in a couple of states, but where they've done redistricting, it really creates some differences here. In New York, you'll see where they're essentially, except for a couple districts that are blue, in and around the city, that changes with redistricting. So now you're reaching out into the western part of the state where you have a potential couple pickups and more around outstate or those kind of, I guess, the suburbs of New York are now they're toss-ups or they're leaning heavily Democratic. So I think this is probably one of the states that you'll see one of the biggest changes here, and that could impact, this is one of those other changes that you can't account for modeling. So this could impact and probably will impact the Democrats being able to go after. And I think you can see there's at least a couple seats here that are going to be toss-up. The Senate is even more interesting because what we have here is a lot of very safe states for candidates. And what we have here in the middle is a close number of Senate positions that are really in play. And if you're kind of watching and if you kind of read and if you even ask the campaign, Senator Tester is really struggling against a candidate who's got his message down and is going. So I think, right now, based on the kind of current lineup and the toss-ups and the number of seats that are kind of in play, conventional wisdom right now is, again, if it's a closer election, that the Senate flips and probably flips by one to Republican control. So we could have two chambers flipping their identities to some extent of how they behave. So that'll be really, really interesting. And more interesting in the Senate is who's now in charge? Because the current leader in the Senate is retiring and has been there for a number of years. So who comes in next and what kind of, in the Senate, where you think it's more cultural and more cordial is the word I was looking for. We'll see if those dynamics shift, and it does become a little bit more of an insular body. All right, now I want to take us to the big race. And I thought this was a very interesting map. So what Cook does is it takes aggregate results of polls and kind of combines them and weights them together on a number of different factors. And the biggest thing here is, again, right now, a snapshot taken today, if you had to do it, clearly Harris would be the winner. And she'd win very, very convincingly, almost like Biden did. Numbers, similar numbers there. And it takes 270 to win. However, the real story here is, and you've heard this probably a bunch in the media, is the 7 essentially states where the margins are less than 2%. The interesting thing here is in most of the other states, the margin is more than 4%. And most of it's more than 10%. So clearly they're in one corridor or the other. And so we have essentially these 7 states here that are polling at less than 2%. And the reason here is if you add those up, that's 88 electoral votes. And so most of the conventional wisdom is saying this is where the election rests. And the campaigns are actually putting their money around these 7 years. So I wanted to break this down a little farther. So again, you saw that little blow up on Pennsylvania there that kind of showed the 1.2% in favor of Harris. Here is the actual breakdown currently of those states. Again, this is aggregate. It's not the most recent poll that's been done by somebody that says it's 3% or 2% one way. But I think this is probably the fairest way to look at where things are going. So what you see here is Harris is up in most of these states. Although usually as you get towards the elections, things start to tighten up. And I expect these numbers to tighten up and sway back and forth on a couple different fronts. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And again, all the other states are at 4+4%, meaning that they're probably going to go to the candidate that's dominating. So we kind of look at here, then we start to count up the numbers. And okay, we have solid or very likely Democratic victories with 226 electoral votes for the Democrats. And for the Republicans and Trump, it's 219. So a little bit of a differentiation as we're kind of going into there. As we dive down here, then you start doing the math. What is it? And this is what the campaigns do in and out. This is where they put their money is like, what does it take for me to get to 270? So you can start to do it. And most political pundits will say that the path to victory for Vice President Harris is through the North Midwest country. So talking Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And actually you'll see this stat a little bit. That's traditionally, that's happened in 15 out of the last 18 elections. Has been basically, these have been won by the Democratic candidate. Again, moving in the right direction. Very interesting and different for former President Trump. What you're looking at there is he has to kind of run the inside straight. You know, he has to run North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and then pick up Nevada and somebody else to get 51 votes. So even with Nevada and those other states that I just mentioned, that gets him to 50. It doesn't get him to 51. So it really is, they have to kind of do something and they know it. So what you're hearing scuttlebutt in the background right now is you're hearing, oh, they're talking about Maine and how do they divide up, or Nebraska, and since they allocate by individual, votes per district, they're squabbling about that. You're seeing in Georgia, its elections board. You now say that all the votes have to be hand counted, which is going to throw all kinds of chaos in there. It's going to be challenged in the courts. We're going to have to kind of see, but you're going to see more of that kind of behavior focused on these states. I predict like Bedlam in Arizona when they go try to target or make it tough for a couple counties to vote. So we'll kind of see what kind of manifests itself.
May I
However-
ask you another question?
Yeah, go ahead. Pick up the microphone so the audience can hear you.
So with what's going on in Nebraska and Maine, so I know Nebraska right now, they're holding the line and saying we're not going to split the electoral votes, but that could go right up to election day, couldn't it?
It could. Although if it changes, then it's likely to be challenged in the courts.
So you
Um,
think for this election, it'll hold the way it is?
I don't see how they have the election and have that not be challenged and stay up. I think most, when it goes, I think even to the Supreme Court, they would probably apply some kind of reasonable test, like, no, you can't you can't change the rules, or Lucy, you can't pull the football just before, Charlie Brown's going to kick it. So that's my sense. And the same thing Maine is a little stricter on how they apportion theirs, and those are actually wrapped up pretty well. There's really only one district that's in play a little bit. Most of those are pretty firm on one side or the other. So that's why you don't kind of see them kind of jump out here. However, we talk about an October surprise. I think we're seeing one in September right now. It's called Mark Robinson, who's the Republican candidate for governor. And he allegedly has put some things or said some things on some porn sites or something that are fairly, they're not nice. And we'll see, but it's impacting his race definitely. And we'll see if that has any drag on the rest of the Republican races, particularly the presidential. But I think what you're going to see and what I've started to see is the numbers start to favor Harris in some of the polling. So I think in North Carolina, that's going to get real small, real quick. And it'll be interesting to see where that heads. But there's always some kind of October surprise. But right now, I would say this is the September surprise probably in North Carolina. And because it's so key, if Trump can't pick up North Carolina, he loses his inside straight. And he would have to essentially pick up Pennsylvania, which I think is a hard get right now. I mean, and I think it's trending the opposite way. Bottom line here is what you have to remember, and what you're going to start to see is it's all going to be about turnout. How do you get your voters to come out? And there's two ways. There's going to be a lot of get out the vote activities. They're going to pump millions and millions of dollars into the get out the vote act, in these 7 states. Mark my word, they're already making the buys. They're already getting everything ready for that. So you're going to really see the focus kind of gin up on making sure they can get their voters out. On the opposite side, you're going to hear all kinds of dirt and stuff fly to try to depress the vote. So, we'll see but expect mayhem in these 7 states in general as we kind of lead up to the election one way or another. So a couple a number of fun facts. I'll share this later, and you can kind of take these at a cocktail party. But I like this one. The vetoes issued. George Washington had 2 vetoes Abraham Lincoln, 7, FDR, 635, world record. But here, Reagan, 80, and again, he had a Democratic Congress that he opposed. But Donald Trump and Joe Biden, only 10 in comparison. So, you know, it's interesting. The calculus goes in things before they essentially can meet both parties because of those narrow margins that you don't see the overrides. A couple other things. This is one that everyone knows, that the percentage of U.S. voters who would be more likely to vote in the 2024 presidential candidate if Taylor Swift endorses them. Well, she has said yes to one candidate, and the prediction is 18%. And I think you'll see some of that. So that will be one of those things is, you know, will they get the Swifties out to vote in those 7 states? Bank on it. Bank on it. Anyway, there's some other kind of fun facts here. So I think that's the takeaway here. It's going to get very interesting over the next month. And it's all going to be about turnout because of the close votes that we're seeing here. Again, if I had to predict based on today, I would say the Senate flips Republican by 1, the House flips by 3 to 5 for Democratic control, but only marginal control. And who knows, you know, how many Barry Sanders are, you know, there who will see them go independent on the Democratic side, or say, okay, no, I'm going to come over, I'm going to vote for the Republican Congress, caucus. So that will be kind of interesting if that happens. And then the House, I would say Harris has done a good job getting where she is today, but she has a lot of work, and the campaign knows she has a lot of work to kind of deliver that. She has to, and I think what you'll see is they have to more than define who she is and why you should be voting. And again, I think what the issues you're going to have is some of those touchstone issues like abortion, and you'll see that play more and more as we lead up to the election, particularly.
Thank you so much. I'm Ashley Casvan. I am the Managing Director of IAPP's AI Governance Center, and I'm really, really happy to be here today to share some insights on an important topic. I was able to catch some of the end of the last presentation related to some of the election considerations. Maybe off the top, it's worthwhile to share that we are a politically neutral organization, both in terms of we are not here to provide any policy advice. So I'm really just here to share some of the landscape and research that we've done, landscape analysis and research that we've done on this space. And it looks like I am freezing.
We can see your slide.
Wonderful. I don't know what's going on, but I will just start by identifying that AI regulations are very real. I'm happy to share this presentation with you. As you'll note, that many of the links that I'm including are actually cited within here. And so I'll go through quite a bit of information, but just so you know that you can be able to find this after. If you're not already familiar with this, the European Union just a few months ago officially passed what's known as the EU AI Act. As you can see from this, it has a much longer title. And what's important to note is that a theme that I will speak through in what we're seeing as well in state legislation is that the scope of where regulators are really looking at how to oversee AI is very specific to the types and uses and context of AI. And so given that your work covers, I understand the intersection of healthcare and advertising or marketing more broadly, it's important to know that when thinking about, and I'll speak to consequential uses and high risk in a moment, but the EU AI Act really references high risk types of uses of AI, and healthcare is among those, as you can imagine, things that are quite important to people's health and livelihood and wellness are definitely of consequence. And so a lot of work in even state legislation doesn't go to the extent that the EU does. However, we are starting to see across all nations and really then trickling into subnational governments, the important role that legislators are recognizing that AI doesn't have the same geographical boundaries as other types of tools, products that we've tried to regulate in the future. And so we're seeing a lot of harmonization as it relates both to the principles and concepts, as well as the requirements, and as well as then some of the standards and best practices that we'll see. So I think that even though it might seem out of scope for a discussion related to the role of AI regulation in the US states or in US states, it is actually quite significant what the European Union's done. And I'll try and reference this as much as possible, but you'll see where many of the definitions are actually really seeking to be harmonized with that legislation. However, there are some differences, and as you can imagine, a lot of what's happening in the US also then is coming from some of the direction that we're seeing from the federal government. And so in absence of a agreement that's come together, a bipartisan agreement that's come together related to AI legislation, what we saw in December of last year was an executive order 14110, or known as the AI executive order, which Biden had then enacted. And so from this perspective, it is quite a lengthy document. It's really primarily focused on how the government's use of AI systems should be done in a safe and responsible and trustworthy manner. As you can imagine, that does, again, really focus on, as I was mentioning with the EU AI Act, the focus or emphasis on those higher risk applications. And so where the federal government services or use involves healthcare, there are several mentions of that throughout that document. My colleague Coben and I have done some analysis on this, and I've included a link to the article that we've written on that. But we also have been trying to follow where a lot of the progress has been made. What's quite striking about the AI executive order is that there was a recognition that there could be a change in government, and that a lot of efforts were to be made in quite short order. And so I think that Stanford has done a really great job of actually tracking the various different objectives or actions coming out of the executive order for the various different departments and agencies, which range really from creating new types of legislation to do some research and put working groups together. And there was quite a few for NIST to be able to create a safety institute, as well as create additional recommendations in terms of some of the work that's underway. And so I definitely recommend checking all of that out. It's too much to go through in our presentation today, but I think that, again, similar to what I was mentioning with the EU AI Act, you'll see that there's a lot of common themes and requirements that are coming from these from the executive order. One of the things that I find interesting as it relates to state legislation is that we're starting to see similar definitions even for what the scope of certain types of AI systems are. I can get to the different types of technology that are often being thought about, but one of them, as I'm sure you've heard of a lot, is in the news lately, are generative AI systems. And it's quite interesting because this was the first time in the executive order where we saw really trying to put a definition around size of these systems and how that would then determine what was in scope or out of scope. And so the definition that was used was 10 to the 26th flops. And we've seen that now be integrated into the latest draft of the UI Act, which is now the final one, but this was still in progress and drafting through the course of this year, as well as then in state legislation in California, which has been passed passed but not yet signed. So just a lot of different, I think, areas of importance and places where we can probably intonate what will become best practices or requirements that we will need to follow, even though it might not be explicitly focused on medical devices or healthcare as explicitly as we'll see with some of the state legislation. So moving on then to state legislation, what we have seen is that we're doing work, and this is a snapshot of our tracker where we've been looking at what the various different AI governance bills are that are being proposed in the various different states. And we break it down into a couple more categories than signed, passed, and introduced, but just for purposes of summarizing that, I think it's worthwhile to know that there have been many, many bills that have been introduced, and 2 of them have been signed to this point. For purposes of our tracking, we are looking at comprehensive legislation, and so that are pieces of legislation or bills that are proposed that are covering all different types of uses of AI, including healthcare, but also including other types of consequential decisions or high-risk systems, which I'll mention again, I'll get to in a moment. So as it relates to this, I guess it's just important to note at a high level that even though there's only been 2 that have been signed, there's 3 that have been passed and are awaiting signature. And again, that's just counting the comprehensive. In California alone, Senator Gavin Newsom signed just last week 3 separate pieces of AI legislation that aren't comprehensive, but are speaking to certain aspects of use of AI appropriately. And so we're starting to see a lot more efforts related to, even in a more narrow scope, really trying to put some rules around the uses of these systems, recognizing that they have impact, they have harms, and they have risks that can proactively be mitigated. So some of the common considerations, we've done some analysis on this, as you can imagine, to get to that state legislation tracker. And so the different considerations are really that AI is a product. And so even the EU AI Act is based on product safety legislation. There are considerations for bias or harm, which we're also seeing at the state level. And so there's the implications of how is that impacting somebody's human rights, which is obviously important when you're thinking about its application in healthcare. However, what's important about this consumer protection alignment is that there already are laws that cover the scope of that, in addition to then certain types of legislation that's covering medical device use. And so what these pieces of legislation are doing are really trying to look at where there are gaps in consumer protection legislation as it relates to the different types of harms that can come from those systems, and then really trying to fill in those gaps. Additionally, as I've been mentioning, so what we see in Colorado and California is the use of this term consequential systems. I'll come to that on the next slide, what that actually means. And then what we see in the EU, Utah, other legislation that we see at the state level, as well as the executive order, are really a focus on high-risk systems. I wouldn't necessarily use them interchangeably because they, as you'll see on the next slide, are offering different ways in which consequential is being thought of. However, it's all amounting to the same concept, which is that not all types of AI systems need oversight or regulation, but focusing really on those that are going to have the highest degree of impact or harm to the public. Additionally, we're also seeing that there's many, many different terms being used for the different types of AI technologies. And so, as I mentioned, kind of the what we're hearing the most in the news is related to generative AI systems, ChatGPT, Claude from Anthropic, etc. And so these are text, image, voice systems that are generating synthetic content based on the historical data or existing data that's being used as in a prediction. And so from that, and we even saw last week, OpenAI announced a brand new system, GPT-01, and its ability to compute various different mathematical models is quite outstanding. And so it is interesting to note that these various different definitions and ways that legislators are trying to carve out what's included in legislation is trying to, again, focus on what those implications are from those different types of technologies. Similarly, we're seeing that there's considerations specifically whether you're a developer or a deployer. Some legislation is referred to that as user or provider. The main idea there is who is responsible for adhering to that legislation or to making sure that those requirements are satisfied. And so often what we see, and again, this is stemming even from this global legislation that we see with the EU, is that most of the requirements are on the developer of those systems. However, it's important to note that even if you're thinking about a procurement life cycle, that there are implications whether you're a deployer or a provider or a user of those systems as well. And again, our state legislation tracker breaks this down a little bit better than we have time for at the moment. And then, as I mentioned, there's really these considerations, not just for thinking about them in terms of consequential or high risk, but where can some of those gaps that I was referring to before really be carved out more within certain types of sectors or industries, and again, focusing on those ones that have that highest degree of impact. And so we're seeing a interest in putting legislation forward specifically for employment systems, healthcare systems, housing, etc. And then finally, what we're starting to see is that all of these pieces of legislation, you can't capture all of the different types of requirements that you would want to see to a certain degree of nuance. And so we're starting to see specific standards or reference of specific standards or emerging best practices related to that. And so since I've mentioned consequential and high risk a lot because it is quite foundational to the scope of all of these different types of systems, I've just listed on the left-hand side the different types of categories that we commonly see, and again are in alignment with a lot of that, the global concepts as well. I'll say global concepts. What I mean really is that it's related to the EU AI Act. However, just know that that's the first legislation that's actually been adopted that broadly. And so there were a lot of contributors from many nations, including the US, contributing to the thought process around it. So that's why I mean global. With that, I won't read the definitions out to you, but why I think that it's interesting to share what even the nuance between consequential means is that there's that approach of how it's impacting the consumers versus how the judgments would be made. And so we're again starting to see that there's some cohesion or coherence around how consequential or impact is being thought about. And then again, based on the analysis that we've done, and I've actually included the link to the article that Coben and I have written on this together, separate from the AI executive order, where we've broken down what the different, we called them flavors, but the different types of requirements that we're seeing within these different pieces of legislation are. And so I think that for anybody that's familiar with some legislation in AI, a lot of these will seem quite familiar. However, a couple that I would like to point out are, especially as it relates to healthcare, are specifically the notification. And so many times it's been, because I think that some of this has actually been derived from different types of healthcare applications previously or uses, is that you have to actually notify the consumer that you are providing healthcare via an AI system and that they provide their consent for that. Similarly, providing some transparency across the process so that there's specific labeling or notification that's being used to indicate how an AI system like a chatbot, a system that's providing recommendations for the doctor or to augment the doctor on healthcare practices, that you as the consumer are actually notified. Again, you can think about some of this as it relates to that intersection of marketing, and that you would want there to be some transparency in those processes, and that's also what we're seeing from a public trust perspective, is that people are not necessarily distrusting of AI. They're distrusting of the fact that they don't know when and how AI is being used, especially when it has such a degree of a strong or high degree of impact on their livelihood or wellness. Non-discrimination is a major one. And again, making sure that there's fairness and parity and equity across the healthcare use of applications is quite important. I wanted to bring this also to the forefront, given the context of your group. One thing that I think has fallen through the cracks in a lot of broader digital governance implications, and that's probably a conversation for another day because there are a plethora of intersectional different types of legislation in this space that are important to consider. And advertising, and this was reported by one of our sister organizations, the Future Privacy Forum. Tatiana Rice does a lot of their AI reporting there, and she noted in her report on state legislation, AI legislation, that advertising isn't really covered very well. And I find it super, super fascinating because there's a lot of conversations related in this space that all of you would know better than me, related to that intersection of how are we dealing with social media and online applications, how that relates to advertising, and where are people getting and accessing their information. And so I just thought that I would flag that. Similarly, we've also been following the work that a lot of different law firms are doing and working on that are based in our community. And I just wanted to, again, link to this one report that you can go and see that I think provides a lot of really excellent information on broader governance trends in AI and healthcare outside of legislation specifically. And one of the points that they noted is that what I was just mentioning is that there's various different intersections of existing legislation as it relates to AI. And that includes privacy and data security, medical device regulation, reimbursement and fraud abuse, and then also quality of care and transparency. And so in this presentation, they link to some examples of that. So I would encourage you to check that out. And separate from legislation, there's broader AI governance efforts that we're starting to see from healthcare institutions. And so even what they were finding in this is that healthcare workers must disclose when they have generative AI interactions with customers. So back to what I was mentioning, some of those common requirements related to that disclosure and ideally consent, so that those customers do have options. And then, as I mentioned, what we're starting to see just more generally is the scope being reduced, especially at the US state level, in terms of moving away from broad-based, comprehensive state legislation, which makes our tracking very difficult, but really getting into more nuanced and focused pieces of legislation, trying to tackle one challenge at a time. And so an example of this from a healthcare perspective is in Georgia, HB 887 is looking at the intersection of insurance and artificial intelligence, and again, related to some of what is allowed, not allowed, and then also how is that done in a transparent manner, and how is that consent being provided. And then, as I mentioned, more broadly, it's important to note that legislation based on both speed, some of the election considerations that were just discussed in the last presentation, as well as just the ability to act, I would say, in a bipartisan manner. We're seeing a lot of, whether it come from institutions or whether it come from bureaucratic departments, broader government efforts related. Again, these are examples just in the healthcare context, but we're seeing them all across the board, where there are various different efforts like setting up a generative AI in mental health care practice, assessments. And so for those of you that are interested in impact assessments as it relates to, I would say this clear derm guidelines are really helpful for all types of medical device systems, but their research was specifically focused on dermatology applications. They provide a checklist, as you can see, for assessing the different type of risks that can come from systems. And so these are just, again, useful to know that they exist, and that they are also, I believe, working to inform a lot of the different requirements that I mentioned that we're seeing in this legislation previously. So I'll leave it there, see if you have any questions, but again, I've tried to link everything in the presentation. There's general resources here and here as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. Super timely and definitely a topic that we will be following along with you. Are there any questions for Ashley? No? All right. Thank you again. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Ashley.
So thank you to Jim for putting this together, and thank you for inviting me to give the group a quick tax update on what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. Tax is a perennial issue that we work on at the 4As and have been doing so for over 40 years now. So it's an issue that tends to be evergreen for multiple reasons. Next slide, please. So before I talk to the group a little bit about what myself and my colleague Amanda Anderson are hearing from the Hill specifically about advertising and taxes, I thought it would be useful to take a step back and set a little bit of a baseline for what kind of where we are, how we got there, and what we can expect to see going into 2025, because I'm sure a lot of folks already know 2025 is going to be a very, very pivotal year for tax policy for a multitude of reasons. One of them is obviously the expiration of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. But another factor that's really, really going to be driving the tax debate going into 2025 is kind of what you're seeing on the slide in front of you. We have a fairly substantial federal deficit at this point, and it is growing substantially every year. We are currently at about $34 trillion in federal debt right now. That's substantial. That's a pretty big number. And it's also interesting to note that if you look back back to 2001, we actually had a surplus in this country. So running deficits indefinitely is not something that actually has been a policy of the United States government or the budgetary process. It really isn't about the past 23 years that we have seen this enormous, enormous deficit continue to grow. I would say that it's not something, it's certainly not something you're seeing candidates campaign on going into this election season. It's not a sexy issue to talk about for a multitude of reasons. But I want to bring it up as we talk about tax policy here, because I will say that I am starting to hear more and more members of Congress talk about this in more closed door meetings. I'm not sure it's trickled out as much to how they talk about it, but they're definitely starting to talk about it more and more in closed door meetings. And it's not a Republican talking point. It's not a Democratic talking point. It's not a House versus Senate. It's all of the above. So I am starting to see more members of Congress talk much, much more in these closed door meetings about the deficit, what their thoughts are on what they think is going to change and how they're thinking about the deficit in the context of the big conversations that are going to happen in 2025 around tax policy. So next slide, please. So I think this is an interesting just sort of way to think about or way to be reminded, you know, how did we get to this $34 trillion deficit that really has grown since 2001? And it wasn't just one thing. And to be very clear, it wasn't just one party. It was a combination. But there are several very, very discrete things that led us to where we are, you know, starting in 2001 with the Bush tax cuts, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, recession response. You know, some of these things were very deliberate policy choices by both parties. Some of them, like the recession response and the coronavirus response, they were emergency spending responses. You know, whether or not you agree with how the money was spent and how long the money was spent is a personal decision. But whatever the case may be, these are kind of the discrete events that really led us up to that $34 trillion deficit. Now, some of them were discrete events like the recession response, coronavirus response, but some of them are obviously much more evergreen and have led to more, you know, sustained deficit spending over time. So it's not just one thing, it's not just one year, it's not just one party, but this really is the big picture culmination of events that have led us to that $34 trillion deficit. Next slide, please. So I think this slide is useful. This wouldn't really be new information, I think, to this particular audience. But this slide is really useful just to have that sort of baseline understanding of where does the federal budget go? And if you look at the slide, you can see pretty clearly that quite a bit of federal spending is utterly non-discretionary, and that a lot of money is already spoken for well before it ever makes it into the Treasury's coffers. So despite all the, you know, back and forth and arguing we see over a lot of budget, a lot of it is discretionary budget. And there just isn't a whole lot of discretionary budget for the federal government right now. I mean, we've all heard about the problems with long-term solvency issues with Social Security, with Medicare, with Medicaid, but these are problems that are continuing to grow. And these are deficit items that are continuing to grow. So as these numbers continue to grow, you're getting more and more pressure and you're getting more and more pushback. And right now it's still a little bit closed doors on the Hill, but about these issues and about these tax policy issues. Some of these things, you know, they're generational driven. Some of things like Medicaid's really being driven by the explosion in long-term care costs. And that's something that's really not going to go away, particularly when you consider we are very much an aging country. So the long-term care costs that Medicaid is experiencing right now are something that is very much predicted to continue to grow fairly substantially. Other things like Medicare, a little bit different. There's been some studies lately that say some aspects of Medicare spending have leveled off a little bit. I think it was a little bit of surprise to some people who study those issues. So whether or not, you know, in what degree Medicare keeps expanding, again, we are demographically an aging country. It does seem logical that that will be the case. All right, next slide, please. So that kind of brings us to the big picture of where we are going into 2025. So as I mentioned at the beginning, 2025 is a very big year, particularly with more than 30 provisions of the 2017 Trump tax cuts are automatically expiring. Not every provision of the tax cuts are automatically expiring, but quite a few. So you look into what the candidates have been talking about tax policy going into 2025, and I've got some examples for what both candidates are thinking about in terms of tax policy. Aspects of Harris's tax policy are a little bit, I would say, not hugely substantially different from a lot what we've seen from the Biden administration. I would say a lot of Trump's are kind of a continuation. He would like to see the tax cuts that he enacted in 2017 preserved. There are some differences, though. One of the things that the Trump campaign has said that they'd like to do, they said they'd like to lower the corporate rate even further to 15%. That's not for every business. To be clear, that doesn't apply to every business. It's for certain businesses. A lot of that provision has to do with manufacturing in America, et cetera. But he has said that he would like to lower the corporate tax rate to 20% just across the board, regardless of the American manufacturing. So looking at, lowering the tax rates even further. Some other things we've seen is this exemption of tip income from income tax. This is the rare policy that both the Harris and Trump campaigns seem to agree upon. I would say that's probably largely a reflection of trying to woo voters in Nevada. Nevada is obviously a state that has a population that's pretty heavily dependent on tip income. So that seems like a little bit of a play for Nevada for me, amongst other things. Other things you're seeing, Harris would be quadrupling the tax on stock buybacks. You've all probably heard about the 25,000 assistance for first-time home buyers. No new taxes under 400K for households with a combined incomes of 400K. And like I said, Trump is a little bit more of just what you saw in 2017. So he'd like to keep the same current tax rates, brackets, standard deductions, etc. I would say, it's a little hard to say with Harris because she came into the campaign obviously fairly late for obvious reasons. It's hard to say what fully her tax policies are yet because it's just not been the primary focus, not been the primary issue for her campaign. But overall, I really, in some ways, would not expect her policy to deviate too far from what you saw with Biden. And then with Trump, I think you would continue to kind of see that sort of a little bit of a status quo with the 2017 cuts, with some being a little bit more aggressive than they were. So that's just a quick abbreviated background to sort of lead up to what I wanted to share with this group. And that's how we at the 4As have been engaging with the Hill, specifically on the issue of the taxes on advertising. So the 4As has actually been working for, over 25 years at this point with an entity called TAC, which stands for the Advertising Coalition. And we work with some of our fellow trade associations like the Association of National Advertisers, but we also work with a lot of broadcasters and other entities that have a strong interest in preserving the deductibility of advertising in the year of spend. And what we've been doing via that coalition is both myself and my colleague Amanda have been meeting with Hill staff over the past year. And we've been meeting with the House, we've been meeting with the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, anyone we know who's sitting on committee that's involved with taxation. And what we're hearing at this very early stage from the Hill is that, quite frankly, going into 2025, everything is on the table when it comes to taxation, meaning everything is going to be up for debate as to what's going to happen. Traditionally, the advertising industry has gotten, quite frankly, pretty broad-based bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans on the House and Senate side for preserving the deductibility of advertising 100% in the year of spend. Like, that's typically support that we've gotten for many years from both sides of the aisle. There have been some back and forth and some threats to that as recently as 2017 with the Trump tax cuts, when there was a proposal to change the structure of that, whereas only 50% of advertising would be deductible in the year of spend, and the other 50% of advertising would have to be amortized over the next 5 years. That was actually a proposal that was fairly popular in 2016, 2017, and was very much on the table in inclusion in the final package. The 4As was able to work with our coalition along with other entities to beat back that provision. But that's not to say that that proposal wouldn't be on the table again in 2025. We have not heard that definitively from the Hill, but because it's something that has gotten traction before, there's kind of no reason to think it wouldn't necessarily get traction again. But I will say the other thing that we're really hearing from both the House and the Senate, as far as the deductibility of advertising, that is very relevant to this group, is we have had Hill staffers tell us that while they don't necessarily think, the deductibility of advertising 100% in the year of spend is necessarily on the table, they do think that taxation, specifically of pharmaceutical advertising, very much is on the table going into 2025. And that's because it makes a more attractive target for a lot of offices, particularly when they talk about those savings being used to apply to Medicaid, Medicare deficits. So we have seen legislation introduced this year, specifically addressing the issue of deductibility, specifically of pharmaceutical advertising. Didn't go anywhere. I don't believe it had any Republican co-sponsors. I think that was purely a Democratic introduced and co-sponsored bill. So a bill that doesn't have bipartisan isn't going to go anywhere, even though most legislation doesn't go anywhere right now. But one without bipartisan support is even harder to get to go anywhere. But like I said, going into 2025, this is very much an issue, and it's something that we at the 4As and some of the other trades and companies we work with are really doing a lot of education on the Hill, talking to them about the importance of preserving the deductibility of advertising. And it's something that we're going to have to pay very, very close attention to, because like I said, everything is on the table given how much tax reform we're probably going to see in 2025. I know I've done that very quickly, but happy to answer any questions.
Hi, everyone. Amanda Anderson, Vice President of Government Relations at the 4As. I work with my colleague Allison, who you just saw, as well as Jim on some healthcare data privacy issues. So pleasure to be here. I apologize, I'm keeping you guys from happy hour. So I will do my best to make the presentation as quick and painless as possible. But I will caveat that this is kind of dense stuff. So bear with me. There is a point to it, I promise. Okay. So we're going to start with state privacy laws. I think key themes here to understand is states are laboratories of democracy. They like to one-up each other. They like to try new things. And they have severe FOMO. So they, somebody introduces something, someone else is going to amend their law to add that because they think it's cool. So here is the current state of play for privacy laws. The dark gray states are states that enacted them before 2023. So you can see we've had a massive explosion with those red states there. The dark red is the omnibus state privacy laws. The pink or the kind of pink with stripes in there, those have consumer health data privacy laws. So we have about 20 omnibus laws on the books, depending on how you consider Florida, as well as 5 health data privacy laws. The ones that were enacted in 2024 include New Jersey, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Maryland, Minnesota, and Rhode Island. Kind of a mouthful. And then on the omnibus side, the Maryland law actually had some healthcare data privacy language in it. So that one was a big complicated bill that we went to Annapolis to talk to legislators about. Okay, here. Okay. No? Let me do it this way. Sorry. Okay. Technical issues, sorry. Great. Cool. So these are the state privacy laws, the omnibus laws that are currently in effect. There are 9. The most latest last 3 that we had that took effect in July are Florida, Oregon, and Texas. But we have several coming online in the future, even one coming online in October. So, all of these are divergent. The deadlines are different. It's extremely complicated. And I have a lot of sympathy for everybody who's trying to keep track. Here's all the state privacy laws at a glance around key policy areas within those laws and how they compare against each other. You'll notice at the bottom, the global privacy control universal opt-out mechanism is a big area where there's a lot of divergence, although now we are seeing a trend where that is included in state privacy laws. You can see if you look at the column of the CPRA, which is California, there's some divergence there when compared to others. So that's a big outlier. And then Nevada is just a little bit different than the rest of them. It's a lot smaller in scope, just covers website operators. So that's why that one's a little bit different, but a lot of divergence, a lot to keep track of. I want to talk a little bit about some of the omnibus state outliers in particular here. So we have Minnesota and Oregon. They have a language in their law that requires consumers to be able to access a list of third parties, the names of third parties with which you share or sell data. Other state privacy laws only require you to disclose the categories of your partners. So that one is going to be complicated because folks are going to have to keep updating that list as their partnerships change and the like. And I think we'll see more blue states in particular take that route in the future. We have Florida that has a much narrower applicability. The way that it's worded, it's very clear that it targets big tech. You know, there'll be like this many users and operates a smart speaker. Like it's very clear that's Amazon, right? But it does have sensitive data provisions that are applicable to all of most Florida businesses. We have Texas and Florida that have like a very specific notice requirement as it relates to the collection and sale of sensitive data as well as biometric data. Tennessee has this like neat little thing in their law called the NIST affirmative defense, which basically says that if you adopt the NIST privacy framework and you're served an enforcement violation, if you adhere to those specific provisions in that program, you have a defense against enforcement. Started in Ohio actually, and we might see that move to other states. Maryland's law is, I think, even by the standards of outliers, a significant outlier from those. They have a really strict data minimization program, which basically says that unless you are providing a product or service to an individual, you can't be collecting data on that person. And it also has a ban on the collection of any type of sensitive, this ban on the sale of sensitive data from a consumer in Maryland. And then California, we have AB 3048, which requires any browser or mobile operating system to adopt a GPC or a universal opt-out mechanism as part of that offering. And that was actually vetoed on Friday. So that was something that the 4As and ANA and other trade associations had asked for. So we were pretty excited about that. So if that isn't complicated enough, like we're going to be dealing with amendments into perpetuity. We're really seeing kind of buckets of the types of amendments that are being offered in the states at this time. Health data is definitely one that we're seeing. So Connecticut, for example, amended their privacy law to include consumer health information in their sensitive data definition. There are going to be other states that do that as well, I believe, particularly blue states. Kids data, we're already seeing amendments in Colorado and California to protect teens they up the age from 16 to 17, where additional protections are required. Global privacy controls, universal opt-out mechanisms. I think we'll see states that didn't have those adopt amendments to include those, or they'll do that thing where they add it to the mobile operating system or the browser requirement in the future. AI and privacy and that interaction, I think we'll definitely see amendments. And then data brokers, so adding data broker registries, adding additional requirements on data brokers. We're not going to go through all these amendments. There's plenty, but these are the ones just when we talk about scale, just so you understand what we're talking about. These are amendments between 2023 and 2024 that folks are already needing to be keeping track of because these laws are already on, most of them are already on the books, like in Virginia, Colorado, and California. One I want to talk about, and unfortunately it's like cut off at the bottom, which is sad, but the California Delete Act is something that passed last year, and it essentially creates a website in California that anyone who's a registered data broker in California will have to honor a consumer opt-out request across all data brokers. So they're going to be and authorized agents are going to be able to submit these requests on behalf of consumers. So the accessibility of third-party data in California is going to be cut off quite a bit. And they're toying with who is a data broker in California through regulation. It's a mess. We tried to fight it. We're going to continue to see what our options are, but it's something that we're worried is going to catch on in other places. I talk a little bit about Connecticut in there. Connecticut changed their definition of consumer health information to include sensitive data. Their sensitive data definition to include consumer health information so that they have a stronger protections for consumer health data. We have changes to in New Hampshire. We had a nice win where they decided they weren't going to do rulemaking anymore, which is great for us. So it's complex, and even I have trouble keeping track of it. So if your head is spinning, you are justified in all of that. Yes, question.
So, oh. So because it is so complex, one of the kind of ways that we're trying to address it all is whatever happens in California, assume that it's going to eventually go somewhere else and use California as the guideline that we follow. Is that the right way to think about it or not?
So California is definitely the high watermark in a lot of kind of those buckets of mandates that we kind of talked about across that chart. But for example, California doesn't have an opt-in requirement for sensitive data collection or sale. It has actually an opt-out, which is very different from what is happening across I would say, I think all but one other state has that type of framework. So it's yes, but then there's more to it, I guess, if that makes sense. It's not a perfect match, an easy answer. Yes.
I have a
Violet.
question. So very complicated and, amazing to keep track of it all. I was just curious, it keeps a lot of people very busy. Is the federal government thinking about maybe just offering some blanket legislation for everybody so we can all just be even? Because as you know, this means that for every state you're marketing in, you have to, abide by different rules, and it just makes it very complicated.
Really good question. We're going to get there. Yes, I think the answer is yes. But your point, I think before we used to be able to do geo filtering out when it was just 4 or 5 states, you could geo filter out. That's not the case anymore. So yes, we're going to get there. So also want to flag, there are a couple of states still in play in 2024. We have a health data privacy bill in DC and in New Jersey, and then omnibus bills that are happening in Pennsylvania and Michigan. We at the 4As, as well as the other advertising trade associations, are part of a coalition. We do submit comments, we do submit letters as these bills are moving, and we will be doing that this fall as these come through the process. But for the most part, a lot of states end their session in May, June. Just we have a few that are year-round legislatures. Okay, so Jim asked me to put together some predictions on how the election will impact privacy and what we might see next year. So I wanted to honor that. And of course, I want to caveat this because there is a lot at play here in terms of bills that are still moving and also, the election results and how that impacts, who's in charge in the Capitol and the governor's mansion. But I think it's a pretty safe bet to say that Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Vermont are definitely going to introduce bills, and I would say very likely pass bills next year. We've seen a lot of these move very far in the legislative process. They were tanked maybe for one reason or another. The Vermont bill, for example, was actually vetoed because it was definitely an outlier, had a private right of action. It was a terrible bill. I think they'll introduce something else, or maybe even try and override a veto next year. We'll have to see. But I would definitely bet that we're going to have more next year. So I would put money on that. I think we're also going to see states introduce health data privacy bills, particularly those that are in blue states. So New York actually had a bill this year that didn't come to fruition. Vermont had some health provisions in their omnibus privacy law that didn't come to fruition because of that veto that I mentioned. So I think it's coming. And I think that state capitals recognize that there is a hole between what consumers think is being protected because of traditional healthcare laws and what's actually, open, that's not covered by HIPAA and things like that. I also want to flag, so we have these laws moving, but also some states have rulemakings associated with their privacy laws. I think California and Colorado, they have been very active in their rulemakings, and I think they're going to continue to do so. But we also have New Jersey coming online in 2026, and so I think there's going to be processes coming to draft and finalize their implementing regulations for those bills. Cool. Now you asked about federal privacy, or I kind of summarized the theme here as one ring to rule them all, right? Like, wouldn't everybody want just like one straightforward preemptive law? Well, the answer to that is we had something this year. It's called the American Privacy Rights Act that was introduced in April. It had bipartisan support from 3 of the 4 corners, which when I say corners, I mean congressional committees that have oversight over privacy. So a Republican from the House, a Democrat from the House, and a Democrat from the Senate. The Republican in the Senate was like kind of sitting out, taking a wait and see approach. That went through a subcommittee markup, which is the first step in the process. And then it didn't get a full committee markup. And industries like ours is particularly to blame because it was terrible. It was an awful, awful bill. And I want to read you guys a quote from a letter that the 4As and ANA sent to House leadership to, I think, to demonstrate what I mean. So Marla Kaplowitz and Bob Leides had said to leadership, the APRA has a potential to eviscerate the modern advertising industry, devastate small and medium-sized businesses that depend on advertising to reach consumers, force families to pay huge amounts of money for popular ad-supported digital services that they use now for free or at low cost, and drag down our nation's economic growth and innovation for decades to come. So very powerful language. It was an awful bill. It would have, like the state bills, had a rights-based framework where consumers can opt out of collection, sale, can ask for deletion and access and all that. But that's kind of where it stops in terms of similarities from existing bills. Data processing permitted for advertising purposes would be significantly limited. It would create a ban on many forms of data-driven advertising. And even though it would ban a lot of that, in the sensitive data definition, which would have required opt-in consent, you had online activity profiles as part of that definition. So you would have required opt-in consent, even if that ban on the data-driven advertising wasn't there. It also had a private right of action, which allows consumers to sue for violations of the law in some cases. And this is the part I think you spoke to, Violet, about having one kind of standard. It wasn't fully preemptive. So there were state provisions that would still apply, which is what's the point in having a federal law if you still have to navigate the states, right? So it was a bad bill. And we're hoping through coalitions that we're a part of that we can get someone to introduce a better bill that is, I think, better for industry, but also better for consumers, offering choice, giving folks the opportunity to, get the free services that help power, the maps and email and all these things, but also, power the modern economy that's so important, the value that third-party data provides in that. We're going to run through these really quick because, I want to make sure that folks have time for questions, but also that we can get to happy hour here. There were 2 children's privacy bills that were introduced this year and are actually still very active. COSA and COPPA. COSPA is like a modified version of COSA that passed the Senate earlier this year, as did COPPA 2.0. And those bills actually had a markup last week in the House committee, and were advanced. So we could see a vote before the end of the year. COPPA 2.0 would ban targeted advertising to kids and teens and require consent for many data-driven activities for minors. And by minors, they mean under 17. And then CASA is really targeted at creating some default settings for social media and other things to protect kids. They're still hanging around this FTC rulemaking as it relates to commercial surveillance and data security. we're expecting something, a draft notice of proposed rulemaking kind of to come out sometime soon. So we'll definitely be looking for that. But the FTC has been active in terms of investigations and other things in key areas, including healthcare data, as it relates to their authority under Section 5. Other healthcare activity, I want to flag the FTC breach notification rule came out this spring. And then also there was a big, I'm sure many of you are aware of the HHS OCR bulletin that banned online tracking technologies like pixels and analytics and all that on HIPAA covered entities. There was some litigation around that with the American Hospital Association and HHS that ended up falling. The judge ruled in favor of the hospitals this summer, and then recently last month, the agency decided not to pursue its appeal. There were some, I think, misleading headlines about that in particular, where they said that, you know, you're free to use all these pixels now and all that. I would urge everyone to take a look at the ruling in particular, because the thing that was litigated was very narrow to the connection between an IP address and somebody's visit to a HIPAA covered entity. And I think advertisers use other identifiers. And so I would urge you to look specifically at that. Talk to your legal counsel if you decide to pursue any type of tracking activity, because there's also some intersection too with some of the state privacy laws that we talked about earlier. Okay, this one is particularly targeted at so I think some of the holding companies in the office, in the audience here. There is this law that was passed in combination with the ban and the requirement for divestiture of TikTok that I'm sure many of you have heard about. It basically is for data brokers. It bans the transfer of personally identifiable information of American citizens to folks who are considered, axis of evil countries, North Korea, China, Iran, or Russia. I think IAB is working on some amendments to this, but you should really look at your data flows and ensuring that none of your data you're working with any of these types of entities that are based in these places. And also there's some people have interpreted it to mean that the disclosure of covered data when passing bid requests and real-time bidding transactions could also trigger this if the entity is from one of those countries. This is my prediction here for the federal. It's a little bit complicated here, but if you look at the icons, we have a divided Congress with President Trump, a divided Congress with a President Harris, a full government trifecta with President Trump, and then a government GOP Congress with President Harris. Like Jim said, I don't think a Democratic Senate is at all in the cards. So much so that I didn't include it on the slides here. But I would say, like, kind of key themes from this here. In a Trump administration, I would expect less of a priority on data privacy. We have the past administration, and what they did there is an indicator. There was like very little interest in doing anything. Doesn't seem like it's a priority. And even if it does move, I think he's going to defer to a Republican Congress on any type of privacy legislation that would potentially move. We also had the retirement of one of the key sponsors of that APRA legislation that I talked about, and she's been probably the biggest advocate for privacy legislation in Congress thus far. And so unless somebody picks up the torch, I would say it's going to be tough. But I did put some percentages at the bottom where you can see where I tried to hedge it over a 2-year period while we have, that Congress and that administration. I would say a President Harris administration might be a little bit more likely to do some policy on privacy. She could do some executive orders on privacy, possibly on the intersection between privacy and AI, where I think there's going to be a lot of interest. I would also say she would like to keep a lot of the promises that she made as it relates to privacy and the fall of Roe v. Wade for women. So I could see a scenario where a House that is within the is a democratically controlled House introducing some sort of consumer health privacy bill if they don't think they could get an omnibus bill through the Congress. So I could see that. The FTC, I think, under Harris administration is going to continue to be active, although there's talk that the FTC chair, Lena Khan, who has kind of been the face of a lot of the activism, I think there's talk that she might be replaced. I think it's 50-50 on whether or not that happens. I also think in a Trump administration, we might consider, or might still see some of that focus from some of the more conservative folks on the anti-conservative bias in advertising space that we saw with Jim Jordan hauling folks in for committee hearings and doing those types of investigations. So I think he might focus on, if you focus on the ad industry at all and data, I think that's where he just wants somebody to beat up and humiliate. I also think that something important to note is President Trump could have 2 vacancies under the Supreme Court if 2 of the older justices decide to retire under his administration, so that he could nominate the next 2, and that would have, for future privacy cases before the Supreme Court, could have impacts, decades into the future. So happy to answer questions, but that's the crystal ball. Not a perfect, I wouldn't hold my breath on a privacy law. It could come, it could not. Okay, last and not least, what would I expect from industry in 2025 and beyond? I definitely think, because you're going to have pressure from enforcement agencies in the states for folks to begin exercising their auditing rights with their contracted partners. I could see, the exercising between clients and third-party vendors and agencies more into the future. Definitely see more experiments in consented data. I'm sure you guys are all aware that in Europe, Facebook was doing a pay or okay model, basically, where if you didn't share your data, you had to pay more. I could see those types of experiments happening. And then also the impact on measurement and addressability. I think it's going to be tougher, given that you're going to have less data to work with. That's true data. So happy to answer questions. A lot, I know, but really important stuff. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. Any questions? That was a lot, Amanda. Thank you so much. Debbie, yeah.
That was impressive. Lot of good information.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot for us to think about in our line of work. And I want to thank everyone today for just excellent presentations, really impacting the work that we do. The taxes could impact, what our clients' budgets look like. The, data privacy can make it really onerous, especially that bill. I remembered all about that now, and I blocked it out probably, but it was very onerous. It was almost too far out the other side. So just want to thank Jim again for getting together this wonderful panel, and all the speakers today. Thank you so much for your time and for being part of this today, and for all the attendees as well. If you'd like to learn more about the CHC, please visit the website. If you have any specific questions or would like to become a member company, you can always reach out to Jim Potter as well. He can help you with more information. But there are webinars all throughout the year. There's still 2 to 3 more this year, so keep checking your inbox. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the newsletter, and stay tuned for more. So thank you again for being here today. Thank you.